Hello, my name is Danny Nowlan and welcome to this latest episode of Dan's Vehicle Dynamics Corner. In this episode, what I'm going to be talking to you about is why we at ChassisSim do what we do. Now, the reason that I'm going to be talking to you about this is over the last couple of years as I've been doing Dan's Vehicle Dynamics Corner, as I've been writing for race car engineering and with my book, The Dynamics of the Race Car, I've spoken to you an awful lot about the how of what vehicle dynamics is. I've spoken to you at length an awful lot about the how of vehicle modeling and the how of how to apply it. But what I've never really touched upon is the why of what we do. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is such an important feature because to an extent, you can do the how all day, but unless you really know the why of what drives it, then really the sort of how is just sort of hanging out there. And this is really what we're going to be talking about in this tutorial. The first thing I want to touch upon is if you're serious about winning in any endeavor, whether it be motorsport, whether it be in sports, whether it be in any activity that you try, if you want to win, you need to know why. One of the great tragedies of motorsport is it's always seems to be dominated by either the latest gadget or the latest tweak. And really, it's a crutch because often you'll see people will rock up to the racetrack, oh mate, I've got this magic damper or I've got this magic blow-off valve and I'm going to go to, and we go 2 seconds a lap quicker. Well, usually when you find that happens, there's been an awful lot of hard work that's involved in getting you there. But really, I can tell you right now, having had the privilege of working with some of the best in motorsport, I can tell you right now, if you're serious about winning, you've got to know why. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. Don't pass go, don't collect your $200 until you know the why. And really, as I've touched upon before, I have had the privilege of working with some of the best in the motorsport industry, and not just some of the best in the motorsport industry. I've had the privilege of working with some of the best of people who work in military aviation and various other sporting activities. And here are some common attributes that sort them out. Number one, they know their basics inside out, and they're absolutely religious about practicing them. They take absolutely nothing for granted, and they're always looking for that next edge. And really, sort of particularly on that last point, let me sort of illustrate that to you with an example. One of my UK distributors is a fellow by the name of Mike Pilbeam. Now, Mike has been doing motorsport longer than I've been alive, and he's very, very well famous in the motorsport industry internationally. And I'll never forget when I first met Mike. I was actually very, very nervous when I first met Mike because of obviously the incredible track record that he had. And the millisecond that I met him, he just sat me down and said, right, what do you do, why you do it? And absolutely grilled me about what ChassisSim was. And really, I think that illustrates that if you are serious about winning, you are always looking for that next edge, but you're always questioning where things are coming from, why they're coming from it, and really drilling down those basics. And the beautiful thing, ladies and gentlemen, about simulation, it's one of the most powerful tools you can use to determine the why. Now, following on from that, let me now talk about some of the core pillars of what ChassisSim is built on. The first core pillar of what ChassisSim is built on is the BeamPogoStick model. Now, I have spoken about this at length in many of my race car articles. I also speak about this at length in my book, The Dynamics of the Race Car. But the BeamPogoStick model really is the core of any serious multi-body vehicle dynamic simulation package, and that really is the beating heart of ChassisSim. And as you can see, our BeamPogoStick, what we have is it's a really powerful way of visualizing our tracks, our wheelbase, where the CG is, what our springs are doing, what our dampers are doing, what our tire spring rates are doing, and really an instant takeaway you can have just looking at this BeamPogoStick model is you can instantly derive what your tire loads are going to be. But for those of you who are interested, I'll let you derive that yourself. But the derivation will come in about 2 seconds. I'll give you a hint. Do a free body diagram of when the springs connect with when the tire springs connect with the ground. The second core pillar that ChassisSim is built on is the fact that it uses Racecard data extensively to derive the bits that we don't know about, particularly tires and aero. And in particular with tires, what we do is that, so what the ChassisSim tire force modeling estimation and tire force modeling toolboxes are built on is effectively comparing real acceleration to actual real acceleration to simulated acceleration, and actually changes the tire model to minimize the error between the two. And effectively what it's doing is it's using track replays to construct what that error is, and then it changes the tire model to suit. Now, that's effectively in a 2-second snapshot what the ChassisSim tire force modeling toolbox does. But it's one of those core reasons of why ChassisSim has been adopted in so many different formulas. Formulas as diverse as GP2, F3, F3, V8 supercars, touring cars, sports cars, and in many cases, these tire models have been derived without tire rig test data, and it hasn't been hocus pocus. And the reason it's done that is it's basically used the tire loads derived from our tire force modeling. It's used the tire loads derived from our multi-body vehicle model, and by using the fundamental equations of motion, we've been able to fill in the blacks. There's no black magic here, guys. That's the way it works. The third core pillar of ChassisSim is that everything in ChassisSim is done transiently. Let's have a look at this load variation through this corner. As we can see, the top trace is speed. The second trace is steer and neutral steer. The third trace is throttle. And the last two traces are tire loads for the front and tire loads for the rear. And as you can see, as we can see, the millisecond we start traversing over bumps, the millisecond we start traversing over uneven surfaces, and even as we translate from from braking, mid corner, etc., the whole concept of static tire loads, as you can see very quickly in this plot, goes flying out the window. And really, to try and approximate this with static tire loads, quite frankly, is really pushing it. And I got to admit, I've told the story on many occasions. When ChassisSim was first coming together 15, 16 years ago, I actually considered the pseudostatic approach. But the millisecond I did the numbers on it, and particularly started to look at traces that looked like this, that those pseudostatic assumptions got thrown out the door very quickly. And indeed, I'd have to say that I probably looked at it for about 15 minutes and dismissed it out of hand very quickly. Yes, pseudostatic assumptions might be okay in terms of giving you terms of rough ideas in terms of where to go with downforce drag compromises, some rough stabs in terms of where you're going for about gearing. But once you get beyond that, it runs out of steam very fast. And indeed, this core plot that I've just shown you, ladies and gentlemen, is the key reason why everything in ChassisSim is done transiently. And I cannot emphasize that point enough, because really, this plot shows you very clearly the numbers just simply don't add up for the pseudostatic approximation. The other thing that I want to say very clearly is if you are serious, you do the modeling yourself. The simulation results are the full stop at the end of the process. If you are serious about doing this, you are going to be amazed about what you learn in the process. Let me give you a practical example of that. When I was working in a Formula in America, we had absolutely no data on the car whatsoever. So the first thing I did was I measured the car up and I did the motion ratios. And I can tell you right now, we learnt an absolute truckload about that car purely through that exercise alone, particularly when we had to compare the difference between the old motion ratios and the new motion ratio. So really, even if you do nothing else, even if you never run a simulation, you will be amazed what you learn when you go through and you do the process properly of measuring a car up, determining its motion ratios, and looking at your data scientifically as opposed to empirically. And really, this brings me to the point. It forces you to really think about what the car is doing. If you think you understand your race car now, your knowledge of what the car is going to do is going to be taken to that next level when you go through and work through this process. This is why simulation is such a powerful tool. So let's talk about putting that into practice. The 2005 to 2008 A1 GP car. This is a car, in some respects, it's very, very close to my heart. And the reason it's so close to my heart is that this sort of really represented the crossover when ChassisSim went from, wow, this is a good idea, to, oh my lord, this stuff actually works. The challenge that was faced, the error map that was supplied with the car was incomplete, and the tyre data that was supplied was sketchy at best. And the only data that could be leaned on was the kinematic data. Now, this basically arrived from the fact that this car was derived from the Lola Formula 3000 car that had over 12 years of development. And if you looked at it on paper, and just going back to what this car looked like, the series organisers insisted that this car have some rather unique aesthetics for it. The other thing that they insisted on was some rather unique looking tyres that had never been, probably hadn't been seen on a race car since the late 70s. So consequently, all the setup paradigms that you'd established for the Lola 3000 cars went flying out the window. So what was the response? What was our solution to this? First things first. The Aero Toolbox was used to reverse engineer the aero map. That was the first thing that was done. And the reason that was done first was that we needed to know what the tyre loads were doing. Once we knew what the aero map was doing, the next step was to use the Tyre Force Toolbox to reverse engineer what the tyre model was doing. The key thing here was we were using our vehicle model to fill in the gaps. Now, as I said, as I touched upon before, step one was to reverse engineer the aero map. This was an absolutely crucial step in knowing what this car was doing. Now, fortunately, the race engineer I'd worked with had thrown enough at this car that it gave us enough of a knowledge to know where the sweet spot in the aero map, and that was pretty much a snapshot of what the downforce in this car looked like, which was the first piece of the puzzle to dissecting why this car was why this car behaved so oddly. The second step was to reverse engineer the tyres. This was where the Tyre Force Toolbox really came into its own. It compares actual acceleration to simulated acceleration, and by using this and using other bits of simulated data, we were able to put together a really accurate picture. And as you can see in this plot here, what we had, one of the key pieces of the puzzle of this car was the fact that this was an open wheeler running on cars that behave like touring car tyres. That, with the knowledge of the aero map, was so crucial. And really, I think the ultimate postscript to this story would have been about 2 years, it would have been about a year or so after this. And I caught up with a colleague of mine when I was doing a sales pitch. And I pretty much detailed blow by blow what we did. And it was really, really interesting. He was standing up the back going, so that's how you did it. And then when I outlined the Tyre Force Toolbox, he just shook his head and he just said, wow, I never stood a chance. So really, that to me really illustrates the power of when you do simulation properly and when you do your homework properly. So really, to sum up, if you're serious about winning, you've got to know the why. And simulation is perfectly positioned to help you do this. And the thing that makes ChassisSim so uniquely powerful is it's based on a transient model that uses real data to fill in the blanks. I really cannot stress that point enough. The other core thing that I'm going to say is that do the modeling yourself. Now, it's really tempting to look at a lot of pre-made, ready-made simulation and say, wow, that looks nice. I've got this lovely spreadsheet. I can do this. I can do that. Guys, that may look fantastic, but I can tell you right now, that's usually based on data that's come from a race car manufacturer, data that's come from other sources. Now, if all of the people have done their jobs well, fantastic. You'll get quite a bit out of it. But if they haven't done their job well, if it's been done to a price, I can guarantee you right now it's going to lead you down the garden path. And I have lost count of the number of times I've been presented in that situation. But I guarantee you, ladies and gentlemen, if you do this, the results will come. They will always come. And I have seen that reflected again countless and countless and countless times throughout the ChassisSim community. So bottom line, if you want to do well, know your fundamentals, know them backwards, and the beauty about simulation is it's perfectly positioned to do it. And ChassisSim, because of the fact that it uses a transient model and real data to fill in the blanks, is going to put you in such a strong position to use simulation and to use it to very, very good effect. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why we at ChassisSim do what we do.